This is actually more inventive than just Edge of Tomorrow style credits. Cutting in with an emergency news broadcast immerses us immediately into the conflict of this universe. And an alien invasion montage recap is the fastest way to get Tom Cruise running.
We fight. That's what we do.
Oh, how right you are, Tommy boy. Also, Groundhog Day shadowing? There's something so satisfying getting to see Cage before his transformation into the God of War. And ironically enough, had he not tried to blackmail the general, he never would have gone down the rabbit hole. Another thing that's interesting to think about is that the initial go to the front lines and take pictures mission wasn't supposed to be a death sentence, even though it would have been. The attack was supposed to be a surprise. So Cage really sealed his own fate, twice over. A wise tortoise once said,
"One often meets his destiny on the road he takes to avoid it."
We're fixing to invade France. This whole FOB's on lockdown, no calls, in or out.
What a cast. Bill Paxton carries himself with a perfect sense of smarmy, smug arrogance that only he can pull off. Meeting J-Squad like this does a lot to set up the relationship between them and Master Sergeant Farrell. Even though they break the rules, they respect him so much they're willing to serve their punishment even when he's no longer in sight.
Through readiness and discipline, we are masters of our fate.
And at the same time, it slyly introduces one of the themes of this film of controlling your own fate. The pacing of this film is impeccable. We're given just enough of Cage's first day to set up his character and his questionable morals. But it's still made clear that one full day passes before the battle, so there's room to train him with Rita later. And even though he does some shady stuff, ultimately he's a man fallen on some pretty hard times. Every logical recourse he can take has been accounted for, and you can watch the comprehension wash over his face as he slowly realizes he's trapped and destined to die. A Buster Sword is always a win. I know it's not exactly Cloud's sword, but it's the same idea. Also, it's made from a helicopter tail rotor blade, so there's that.
Bloody hell, it's the full metal.
Censoring by Gut Punch. It's made extremely clear that using these suits is an acquired skill, and even just walking in them takes practice. Gives a real sense of time and effort to Cage's training later on.
I think there's something wrong with your suit. There's a dead guy in it.
Death jokes.
How do I turn? Oh my god!
Ugh, the way they capture the absolute terror of being unprepared. It's like this recurring school nightmare I have, where I haven't been to class all semester and the exam is today, or I completely skipped preseason, I don't know anyone on my team, I forgot all my gear and I'm starting. And I'm naked and all my teeth are falling out. Die! I choose die. Like a reimagined future Normandy, the dread of D-Day is recaptured as the troops storm the beach.
It is Normandy?
Oh, I guess it wasn't that subtle. Badass good girl. We've barely even seen Rita's face yet, and she's the most menacing thing happening in this film. And prepare for a few yups. As in now. Yep. Cage gets his first hint that something is off. If the Angel of Verdun can be snuffed out like a noob, what chance do any of them have? All you need is kill Nod with a Japanese control pad.
Here they come. Mean as hell and thick as grass.
Die! I still choose die! Since live, die, repeat is the basic structure of every first-person shooter game, here's a little first-person shooting that looks way harder and more petrifying than any game you've ever played. Let's talk about how freaking creepily awesome the design and movements of the mimics are. Their otherworldly appendage flailing would be enough to make me go into shock. Totally distinct, beautiful CG tentacle monsters with horror creature-like white noise yelling. A complaint that I keep reading is why send the alphas into battle at all? Just keep them at home base and kill them when stuff starts going sour. It seems pretty clear from this one scene that, number 1, the alpha only goes to areas where drones have cleared it of enemies. Number 2, it's constantly surrounded by an entourage of drones for protection. And number 3, it's clearly surveying the battle much like a strategic officer would and relaying battle conditions to the Omega. This plays into my theory about how time travel, the Omega, and Cage all function together that I'll get into later. Brutal. Also, you'll notice that the drones were in a forward position compared to the Alpha, since that's where the danger is coming from. They thought Cage was dead, so the Alpha was closest to the threat and clearly didn't think Cage was going to kamikaze him. I have to point out that up until this point, this movie was an awesome war movie about aliens with a fully fleshed out enemy and future mech suits. That's an awesome movie! And now we get time travel?
Poker night, bachelor party.
What a little glimpse into the quippy people in our lives. But more importantly in TV and movies. Not everyone is as quick and witty as Juno McGuff and Bill Paxton would have you believe, as evidenced by his entirely planned speech.
Incoming!
Saving your future friend. Battle buddy? Immortal mate?
Is there a lot of blood?
You have a hole in your chest.
And some honesty.
Holy fuck!
Death censoring.
Have any of you met me before?
I know you're not all gonna agree, but for me, Tom Cruise is one of those actors that can go full cruise and still pull you into whatever character he's playing. The editing of this film is almost perfect. Once he starts to accept the Groundhog Day-ness of his life, we get to see his mistakes and how he changes things the next day. We're given just enough of each previous day so it's easy to follow, but we never feel like we're seeing the same boring stuff because they show us just enough to keep it entertaining. And now we get into the real fun of this movie. He starts to reap the rewards of knowing what's going to happen. They progress the story forward with jump cuts, but also how his skills are improving. Even those people who hate Tom Cruise should be loving this movie at this point. He's died at least a dozen times by now, and probably more. Leave it to the British to create nightmare mimic robots that mimic the mimics to help fight mimics. Yoga is good for your health.
This is the first time we've had this
You
conversation.
should try this on him.
What the hell is that?
Rita's characterization is so solid. First time she sees him, she casually takes his battery as he's dying. Next time, she disregards rank and treats him like an annoyance unworthy of her time. Now she's ready to use him like a lab rat. Dying every day for close to a year can change you, and she always has the end game in mind. Holograms can make any exposition dump more interesting. Also, from a practical filming standpoint, it allows actors to stay in frame instead of us staring at still images.
First of all, this is a terrific presentation. Terrific.
Compliments. Yep.
Hold on, listen.
Okay, do it.
Accepting your fate. Shoot you in the head / on your feet maggot montage is the fastest way to become a full-on war machine. And slowly detach from humanity and start to understand what Sisyphus went through. Is going through? There is something so familiar seeing this slow progression of failing, planning, failing again, and trying to get it just right. I know some would say this takes the fun out of the game, but a perfect run-through is so satisfying. And a many deaths of Rita montage is the fastest way for Cage to fall in love. Not necessarily romantic love, but if going into battle with someone creates an unbreakable bond, what does watching them die over and over do?
I got something on my face?
Visual storytelling. Before we hear about the man she watched die over and over, we see her clearly recognize the look Cage is giving her since she undoubtedly made it many times. It creates a connection between these two that no one can ever understand. It's the first tiny crack in her steely exterior. Dancing lessons. Who can blame Cage for taking a little break from dying or watching his friend die for a quick bike ride and a beer? Humanizing moment that also nails home the importance of the mission and pokes a little fun at films that spend too long on the why of it all.
What do they want with us anyway?
What difference does it make? They're here. They're winning.
Something that's being alluded to is something that's more explicit in the novel if I remember correctly. These suits have amazing capabilities, but they're essentially on autopilot for the majority of the troops so they don't tear themselves in half from the sheer power of the New Jackets. Killer Cage and Rita use them to their full potential, thus the flying and sliding and otherwise awesome stuff they do. And the reason Rita uses a melee weapon is because she gets tired of running out of bullets.
What the?
Also, yup. In a movie full of awesomeness, the score is also phenomenal and captures the gritty, unrelenting tone of the battle.
2 cars we haven't tried yet, the minivan.
Yeah.
The green SUV.
It's at this point that the days start to become purposefully blurred together the way they definitely would be for Cage. We don't see him die for an extended period of time, so part of it is merging the resets into one continuous day, which, bravo for believing in your audience to understand the mechanics of the resets you've set up and knowing we can follow along, but we also slowly realize that Cage isn't being honest about how many times they've been here.
I'll look around for the keys. That's productive.
10 minutes.
Okay?
And then I'm killing you.
More honesty.
If you start that engine, you die.
This is as far as you go. No matter what I do.
Rita's impatience and seeming lack of logic in this scene annoys some people. But you have to remember that she's a very broken person. It's been established that she lied about her middle name,
That's not my middle name.
potentially as a way to remind herself not to get too attached, and made up a story for the same reason. Cage pushed a little too hard and she felt herself letting her guard down. At this point, relationships scare her more than death. When she realized that Cage was trying to trick her to save her, she began acting irrationally to try and snap Cage as well as herself out of it. I mean, it's no battle axe. And now we get some clear evidence of exactly what happened to Rita and what this life would do to you. Okay, one more defense of what some have called indefensible. So maybe there were easier ways to go about this. It seems like they should have just stayed in the office and stabbed him in the leg and then reset, right? Well, sure. As someone who knows what happens when he gets stabbed, that's a fair plan. But they had no clue. They didn't know how long it would take to locate the Omega. They didn't know if activating the transponder would alert the Omega and it would change locations after the reset. They didn't even know if it would work at all. Maybe it would have just erased Cage's powers or instantly killed him and they would have been totally screwed. Escaping and going right for the Omega was the most logical plan of action.
Now, it's gonna sound ridiculous at first, but the longer I talk, the more rational it's going to appear.
Yeah?
And then he tells me my second grade teacher was called Miss Polio.
I love that Cage's number of respawns is so indeterminate. We're hearing him talk in a very detailed manner about all of J-Squad with information that we didn't actually see him learn, alluding to him spending even more time without Rita when he was trying to save her life. And it's totally rewarding to see them rally behind him after treating him like the pariah and coward he was. He exudes leadership now, and they've clearly shown to respond to strength. Double self-sacrifice. Did I not choose die? So, that's pretty amazing. Everything about it. Amazing. And now you've got two super soldiers who have more combined battle experience than the whole of the UDF. They have the fastest reaction times, almost like premonition. It's the most believable setup for their near invincibility. If you train with no fear of death, you can push your body and find your actual limits, something most humans can never do.
I wish I had the chance to know you better.
Call back to Cage's line,
I wish I didn't know you, but I do.
with ironically the same undertones even though the statements are opposites. And that kiss was improvised by Emily. Some say this is evidence that Cage lied about losing the power to Rita, since the mimic tore Rita in half and only seems to be trying to bleed Cage. Part of that theory is how he seems to be able to predict what's going to happen, and also that he drowns here, which is why it's a separate cut to him emerging. I don't buy it. I prefer to look at it as Cage being a full-blown soldier. I mean, like Kurt Russell soldier. Battle-hardened. Either way, win. Man, everybody is sacrificing themselves. J-Squad's alive. Rita's alive.
Yes? What do you want?
And she's as sassy as ever. There's a lot going on here beyond just she's a pretty girl, I'm a pretty boy, we might as well make babies. Rita basically told him she was more than just the angel of Verdun. That under the exosuit, she's Rose. Someone who still yearns for a connection even if she's terrified of it. She divulged her true middle name because she finally accepts Cage as the only other person on the planet that can actually understand her. And after seeing what he's willing to go through to save her, she sent him this signal to come find her. Sorry, I just don't hate happy endings. Alright, I'll try to keep this brief because man, oh man do I love this movie and I could talk for days about it. But I want to address a lot of the complaints I've read. Let's start with a theory I've been teasing.
So this is all just some theory.
Listen, Cage, I'm only calling it a theory because it's not explicitly stated in the film, but based on how events unfold and the actions and responses of the mimics and humans, this is my understanding. The first issue has already been addressed. The Alphas clearly need to be on the battlefield as they are the eyes and ears of the Omega. They need to be there when they die so the Omega knows what to change in the next loop. Otherwise, they wouldn't be. I'm pretty sure it's established as such in the novel as well, but really it makes sense in the film. There's a misconception that the time travel is a voluntary tool the Omega can use. People couldn't understand why the Omega wasn't resetting the day when Cage was about to succeed in the end. It seems pretty clear that it's nothing more than an involuntary defense mechanism. I think it's also fair to say that since the Alphas are extensions of the Omega, every time an Alpha dies, the Omega feels the death. So the Omega isn't just shooting Alphas in the head every time a Mimic loses a confrontation. It's a last-ditch, Hail Mary, we're getting slaughtered type response. That can't just be triggered manually. Rita and Cage also conclude that if Cage has the power, the Omega does not. It's hard to say whether the Omega retains memories prior to the reset, but either way it works. If it doesn't remember, the Mimics had no clue a new day was starting, and after a few hours of observing Cage based on his epic slaughtering, I'm sure it became obvious he had the power. So any loop that he stayed alive long enough, they'd eventually adapt and try to trick him. And if the Omega does retain memories, it's clearly not remembering Cage's, only the remaining Alphas. So it's resetting the day but knows only that none of its Alphas are triggering the response. The rest of my theory runs under the assumption that the Omega does remember but has no real connection to Cage. We see the connection growing slowly through his resets, but at first he just hijacked the mechanism of Live, Die, Repeat. Whatever that may be, some kind of tracker in the blood or something. The Omega senses an Alpha dying, but it's actually Cage that has replaced that Alpha on the battlefield. This leaves the Omega blind to a really large section of the beach if we assume Dr. Carter's estimate is even close to accurate.
They're like 1 in 6.18 million.
So that's why the Mimics can't adapt to Cage. The last issue is about why Cage wakes up in the helicopter at the end. There are actually a couple explanations. The first is that since he dies the night before the battle, before the Alpha ever gets his blood on him, he resets the Omega's save point since he takes the place of the Omega the same way he initially takes the place of the Alpha. And that works, but it doesn't really matter to me. I think that the Omega exists outside of our understanding of time. As it's dying, it resets the day, pulling Cage with it through its blood. I'd go so far as to say that had Cage not been in the blood, the Omega maybe could have reset and been fine. But since Cage has now taken the place of the Omega, the same way he replaced an Alpha, and Cage can't connect to the Mimics, the connection to the Mimics is severed and they die. So since the Mimics are all dead, Operation Downfall is cancelled and Cage never needs to meet with the General. And I think he technically wakes up at the same time. Waking up in the helicopter was the morning, waking up at Heathrow was like late morning, only a few hours later. But with no operation, he never gets tased. Outside of all the awesome time travel mind bending and the amazing action, we got a really well structured story. And Rita is a strong protagonist. I think the romance subplot is handled very well and they treat her character like a real action hero. Not like some fantasy trope where she inexplicably wears armor that leaves major arteries vulnerable. But just ignore Kimmel in that regard. There's also quite a bit going on metaphorically. They set up early being
masters of our fate,
which is pulled right from Hinduism. It gets brought more into focus once the constant reincarnations begin, where he starts as elevating himself to something that looks a lot like Nirvana, where he's at peace with his decisions. He completely sheds his cowardice and sacrifices himself for all humanity and then enters his afterlife, as in where he goes after he died, which is pretty ideal, I'd say. I made the statement in my Revenge of the Sith video that tonal shifts are present in quite a few films, and this just so happens to be one. I'm pinpointing it because it's done so well here. It goes from comedic and goofy to really dark to awesome sauce to emotional. All these tones complement each other and make the film more entertaining. The third act did lead us down a path of personal despair, and I think that's why a lot of people felt like the ending pulled the rug out from under us and shifted to a happy ending too abruptly. However, circling back to our Hindu symbolism as well as the character arc set up for Cage, I felt that it was totally earned. Cage learned everything he needed to learn and reached the highest level of selflessness available in this movie. Fans of All You Need Is Kill may have also been upset. I won't spoil it, but it's a very different ending and not nearly as happy. Tom, my boy. Some of your finest hours. Just so I can nudge all of you towards the love I have for Tom Cruise, did you know he threw a 6-figure party for the cast and crew after this movie that he couldn't even attend because he was still filming? Just saying. It sounds like they're moving forward with a sequel that's actually a prequel. Part of me wishes they'd leave it alone, but hey, if you had asked me in 1996 if Doug Liman, the director of Swingers, would make one of my favorite sci-fi action films, I might have laughed in your face. Obviously, I'd have to ignore all the Bourne movies he's done, but I'm nothing if not willing to stick to a stupid joke to show you that I know Doug Liman directed Swingers. He also directed the first 2 episodes of The OC, so yeah.
Quick, show the frame.
You guys seemed to enjoy this last week, and like 90% of you got it right. So hopefully this one is a little bit tougher. Hint is that it has a loose connection to a movie coming out in the next 2 weeks.